Apologies. Good afternoon to everybody. Our topic today is about inflation, what it is, causes, and cures. This is an important topic, and this is topical because it affects the overall economy. It also affects market developments. It affects how business behaves, and it affects us all, our everyday life. This is a complex issue, and the causes leading to inflation, and also the policy options, are controversially discussed. So our speakers will try to shed some light on that. So let us dive directly to the discussion. And I ask the speakers to remain within the timetable that we have agreed. Our first speaker will be Ioannis Tirkides. Ioannis is a chief economist in the Bank of Cyprus. At the same time, he's the president of the Cyprus Economic Society. For those of you who don't know the Cyprus Economic Society, I recommend to visit the website. We organize some interesting events, so let me take the opportunity. And Ioannis is also a regular author in the newspapers. I also recommend to follow his articles. His topic is about inflation dynamics, from external shocks to systemic forces. So Ioannis, let's try to set the scene. What is your evaluation of the current situation, of the current inflation episodes? And go also into this discussion about temporary, permanent, supply-driven, demand-driven, and how that has affected developments.
Working? Thank you, Andrea. Well, let me start from the beginning in terms of what's inflation. It's a general rise of the prices on a continuous basis. This is caused by very many factors. The best way to understand it is to think of demand and supply. Right? Higher demand drives up prices, lower demand the opposites, low supply, high demand, again, higher prices on an aggregate basis, the entire economy. And under each of these categories, demand and supply, you find different factors that are pushing in one direction. In terms of aggregate supply, right, you find things that are now causing inflation, like supply disruptions. You had the COVID, which meant lockdowns, which meant supply disruptions of different intensities. You had the global supply chains changing character, relocating, moving closer to home in many ways. All these disruptions were causing higher cost of production and therefore higher prices. On the supply side again, the war in Ukraine and now the war in Gaza are also disruptive and causing inflation. Any war is causing shortages, and any shortage is always inflationary. Right? Transferring production from civilian use to military use, creating bombs and exploding them doesn't add to any supply expansion that's fruitful and keeps prices rising and under pressure. And these were the factors that started the inflation cycle this time around. The story about money, supply, and how it affects inflation, and that dates back to the 1970s. If you recall Milton Friedman, the Nobel-winning economist, and his famous phrase that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, right? That's based on the so-called quantitative theory of money. Which under certain assumptions that are not always there is causing inflation. But the basic idea is that if you expand demand and supply much faster than the pace at which growth is happening, there will be some inflation pressures. This is not always the case. We have had money printing and monetary expansion since 2008, right? At the start and the ends of the global crisis of the period 2008-2009, and then it causes inflation. So it depends on where the money goes and how the money is used that can cause inflation. So back to our current reality, inflation is caused, I think, by two main factors. One is the supply side disruptions that we discussed a while ago, and the pricing of the corporate sector, the companies. There's been a discussion that's very controversial, but it's been shown in some ways that following COVID and following the war, there's been quite some pricing power in the hands of companies. So the industrial structure has changed. They now have more monopoly power, and this allows companies to pass on costs and increase their profits. If you check, so these two are the elements that are causing current inflation, and whether it's permanent or not, all inflations are transitory. If you allow enough time in the economy to expand supply and meet demand, when you have a shortage, inflation goes away. It takes longer, but typically it's transitory from this perspective.
Let's now reflect a little bit on policy responses. So what are the lessons that we have learned during these inflation episodes? And in particular, I would be interested in the interaction of policy, because we are going to dive more in detail on monetary policy. So I'm more interested in how monetary policy, fiscal policy, wage policy, and so on interact together, and what are the lessons that we have learned. I thought it was, it was.
I thought it was Maria, for me.
Okay, let's go to.
No, it's okay.
Okay, but brief.
All right, brief. Well, looking, am I? Works? No? No? Working? Hello? Sorry, guys. Can I borrow yours? No? Okay, let me borrow this one, and we'll share it with Andreas. All right, in terms of monetary policy and the rest, we have seen that the last, how many years from 28? It's 15, 16 years of monetary expansion that did not lead to any inflation of sorts until 2020 and beyond 2020. Like I said, it's a matter of where the money goes and how the money is used for monetary expansion. And in that period, what we have had was the so-called asset price inflation, that the money went from the money printer, the monetary authority, to the banks and to the pension funds, and all the money going into assets like stocks and bonds and property, and which inflated those assets, those prices. So we have had asset price inflation. How it connects with real inflation, the consumer price inflation, is indirectly, but there's a connection, because when you think about the buying power of the population, of the working force, and the wage remains constant in real terms, and then the prices of assets like property increases, the buying ability is reduced further. Why? Because what remains and can affect effectively demand in the economy is what is left in your pockets after you pay your taxes, after you pay your rent or your mortgage. And if the property you buy is double and triple of the time, right? The mortgage is much higher, the interest costs are rising, and what's left to spend is diminished. So the buying power of the majority of the population was not there. Money was taken by the taxman, was taken by the banker, the mortgage payments, was taken by high prices of goods and services, which connected and prevented this monetary expansion you have seen that was immense to translate into inflation.
Thank you, Ioannis. Thank you. Now let's turn to monetary policy, and let us turn to Maria. Maria worked for the IMF on the Cyprus economy. She also served as member of the executive board of the central bank. Recently, she was appointed in the Council for Economics and Competitiveness, am I right? And she also finds time to teach in the University of Cyprus. So let's now concentrate on monetary policy. The general perception is that monetary policy is really effective in controlling inflation in line with what the central bank set as target. So how do you evaluate during the recent episodes the reaction of the central banks, both during the upswing following the pandemic, but also more recently in this downward trend that we are currently observing? We keep changing. So we found ways around it.
Thank you, Andreas. It's a pleasure to be here, to be able to offer a few thoughts on this very timely topic. In addressing your question, let me take a step back first. And I will talk a bit about the role of the central bank frameworks in contributing to economic stability. Then I will go to the recent episode. I will go to the shocks of the pandemic, the war of Russia on Ukraine, and talk about the challenges that they pose to this framework.
You have 4 minutes to do that.
I will do it quickly. And how they tested the resilience of the framework. So today we think of central banks as the guardians of price stability, but this has not always been the case, and at least not entirely. Many of the central banks used to have much broader responsibilities. For example, in the 70s, some central banks were expected actually to buy any unsold treasuries at treasury auctions. Others were asked to influence the allocation of credit to the economy. This role of the central banks has evolved as we had different conditions. So after the oil shock of the 70s and the 80s and the very turbulent times of inflation, a new concept, a new framework emerged, the inflation targeting concept. So in the early 90s, central banks were given a clear price stability mandate, and they were also granted independence from any political influence. This was very important, and what was very important is that came with some other conditions on the central banks. It came with more transparency and accountability. So the central banks had to be transparent in explaining how they formulate their monetary policy, and they had to be accountable for the target that they will achieve. So you can think of transparency and accountability as what balances central bank independence with democracy, essentially. This regime, as Ioannis said, worked pretty well. Actually, inflation targeting was the basis of a period called the Great Moderation of about 30 years between 1985 and before the global financial crisis. Of course, other factors had contributed to the prosperous times, globalization, structural reforms, technological change as well. But the ability of the central banks to pursue price stability independently of political influence is widely recognized as one of the key pillars of the Great Moderation. Now let's move on to the recent events, to the recent episodes. As President Lagarde mentioned in a speech at the IMF, she said that we had the worst pandemic since the 1920s, the worst wars since the 1940s, and the worst energy shock since the 1970s. During the pandemic, there was a complete shutdown. There was incredible uncertainty. At the time, the objective was to save lives. Central banks at the time moved very forcefully to prevent financial collapse and to restore confidence. They cut rates when it was possible to cut rates because some of the banks were already below the zero lower bound. And they introduced emergency measures and subsidized lending to the banks and introduced new bond purchasing programs. Now, as the global economy opened from the pandemic, we were faced, central banks realized that they were faced with an enemy that they thought they had long defeated. So there were a lot of supply disruptions, as Ioannis described, and there was a shift in demand from demand for services to demand for goods. Supply was really unable to meet this. And this is when inflation started going up, and it was kind of unexpected. Then, after the war, we also had the commodity price increases, the energy shocks, which came as a result of the war. These shocks hit the economy sharply, made inflation forecasting an extremely difficult task because of the uncertainty, and may have contributed to central banks having a delayed reaction to the surge of inflation. What Ioannis said about transitory permanent, initially a lot interpreted inflation as transitory, then they attributed it more to the supply side, where the central banks don't have much power. So the ECB, for example, started hiking rates in July 2022, initially going from minus 0.5 to 0. And then they had to hike. They had 3 hikes of 75 points, basically. So they really had to move quickly. So once it became clear that inflation surge was not transitory, that there was the risk of transitioning to a high inflation regime, central banks moved decisively, forcefully, and they gave a message, a signal to the markets that they were there and they were not going to tolerate this anchoring of expectations. Indeed, it depends on the measure of expectations that you use. You could say that inflation expectations remain anchored broadly. And we see now that the central banks managed to significantly reduce the persistence of inflation. So in many countries, inflation now is around 2.5%. In other countries, the outlook is more uncertain. So to go back to your question on whether central banks were too late to adjust the interest rate, maybe they were. But I think, and perhaps one of the important lessons that we get from here is that we have to be very cautious about looking through supply side shocks. And when they realized, though, they were very decisive, and they brought about the result that they did.
Okay. And before turning to Marius, just a very quick question with a request of a very brief answer. How about now? Some analysts would say now the central banks are again behind the curve, and they should have started already with reducing interest rates. What is your view briefly?
I think it's in very uncertain times where we need to rely on a lot of data to analyze, because we cannot just rely on the framework. We have to be very cautious, and with very continued cautious to look on risk management of the central bank policies. So you don't want to risk lowering and then having to reverse. So this is very important. So it's good to be gradual. So I think what is happening now looks appropriate, at least given the data that we have.
Okay, that's why I said in my initial remarks, this is a complex issue. Views are diverging. There are analysts who would claim that both the banks were late increasing interest rates and now again behind the curve. But this is just a view. Now let us turn to Marius. Let's go from macro to micro. Marius was senior risk manager in the Hellenic. In difficult times, he was also the chairman of the Stock Exchange Commission in the early to mid-2000. And even in more difficult times, he was the chairman of the Cyprus Cooperative Bank. Marios has served on several boards, and he's also a regular author in newspapers, so follow him. It's always good. Now, Marios, your topic is about inflation, shrink inflation, and sometimes you talk about skimp inflation. So I guess the majority here, including me, do not know what is this strange animal. So can you give us a definition? Can you give us some examples? What is this shrink inflation?
I'll take you a little bit back in the history of economics. In the last 20 years or so, 2001, psychologists, pure psychologists, win the Nobel Prize of Economics. A bit later on, another Nobel winner, a bunch of Nobel winners, describe in their book how companies, casinos, for example, manipulate, playing on human weaknesses and psychology for their own profit. For example, casinos don't have windows. Why? Not because they are worried their customers are going to be seen. It's because if there is no windows, you lose track of time and you gamble more. Why do some of these betting companies give donations to football federations? They take the guilt out of you who bets on football matches. We go a bit further on and we get to advisors of Obama. It was at the time of economic crisis, and it was the time that they had the crisis of junk bonds. And their first advice when Obama says, what shall we do about the junk bonds? Stop calling them junk. Nobody would buy something that is called junk. Psychologically, how are you going to go to your board and buy something junk? From there on, we have a new stream of behavioral economics that tries to do economic policy on the basis of human behavior. And shrinkflation is something that companies knew. For example, companies knew, that if you put vegetables as you enter the supermarket, you're more likely to buy at the end chocolates. If you put the chocolates at the entrance, you will not buy. You will pass them on. And they know, for example, that when you go to the supermarket, I will put the most expensive stuff eye level. You need to bend down to see the cheap ones. And they use psychology. Now, we know that, for example, you will see in supermarkets, all the prices are things like $5.99. Doesn't say 6. Because you focus on the first number. You don't focus on the decimals. 6 is more expensive than $5.99. And this is how you can get manipulated. And now we come to shrinkflation. what do companies do to mask their price increases? They reduce the packaging. They keep the price the same, but because they know that you don't look at the quantity in the packing, they even keep the packing the same size. You will buy it, but they have reduced it by 10%. Soft drinks are doing it. Cornflakes are doing it. Tissues are doing it. All over the place. And this is what shrinkflation is all about, which is that the definition of shrinkflation was given by Pippa Mulgrave, who was an advisor to Nixon. Shall we go to the...
Yes, this would be my follow-up question. Can authorities do something? Can they help the consumers avoid or deal with this kind of clever manipulation?
Yes, it's two things. Some countries like France and Korea are trying to legislate. And France forced supermarkets to display where they checked that the packaging contains less, or the tin of Coca-Cola shrunk, to have a sign on the visible sign where this product is displayed, warning the consumer. Other societies mention it. The chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the United States, beginning of the year, mentioned something needs to be done about shrinkflation. Media also have a role to play. The media, for example, the BBC had reports, Financial Times had reports, Consumer Watch magazine publishes reports that you hope that the consumer will see. And this is the fine dividing line between being too intrusive and doing something about the problem. And there isn't a good, if you like, solution. And the worse is the other variant of shrinkflation, which it's skimpflation. Skimpflation reduces the quality. And while the quantity you can measure, try and measure if the quality of this chocolate that you bought has less good quality chocolate inside or not. It's much more difficult, but this is the way companies can make profit, and the consumer is completely unaware of it. The good thing is that the retail price index corrects for the quantity, but it cannot correct for quality. And that's the scary thing, because also the consumer that sees the prices doesn't change his behavior when he sees, he hasn't seen a price increase to reduce his consumption.
Thank you, Marius. I think also following discussions or presentations, at least making people aware that this problem exists is a help for consumers. Let's now dive a little bit more into the issues of how does this inflation affect business, one, and also how does it affect consumers. Let's start with business, Kyriakos. He's a general manager of the certified public accountants. Now, there is a criticism widely from economists, but also from the broad public, that companies are taking advantage of certain of high increases, and they increase their margins. So there is a lot of discussion that now it's not wages that are to blame for inflation, but companies. How do you see that?
Thank you, Andreas, and it's a pleasure to be with such an esteemed panel here to discuss a very important issue. Firstly, let me demonstrate how a value chain actually works. We are using your own microphone, Andreas, all along, so it's a demonstration of value chain. Well, it is true what you're mentioning. It actually ties very well with what Marios has just discussed. I wouldn't say, though, it's the only factor that we need to consider, and we'll touch upon it in a while. Okay, we've heard about what inflation is and how it evolved. However, we need to clear a couple of things out as well. When we say about inflation rates, X amount, X percentage, it's actually compounding every year. So inflation, for instance, I've got a little table here, shows that from 21 onwards till today, there was positive, let's say, inflation. So 2021 it was 2.5%, 2022 it was 8.4 on average, although it spiked up to 10 point something. 2023 was 3.5, and now we are running around 2% inflation rate, which means that every year we add to the previous year. So when we say it's 2% this year, it is lower the rate of increase of prices, not that the prices have reduced. So the size of the prices that we see today is actually a product of the previous increases. And these increases, I will allow me to go back a few years only, I will not start from the 20s. But if you see carefully what happens in the global arena, I would say that the first peak in inflation was caused by, during the Trump administration, when he imposed actually a trade war against trade protection measures against China, which resulted in shipping, maritime, and supply chain increases. Then we had COVID with all the repercussions, the war in Ukraine, and the disruption there with the energy prices, the war now in Middle East, the obstacles we've got in free maritime. So there was a continuous array of factors that increase the cost, the prices, the cost of goods and the prices that are sold. Inevitably, some found an opportunity to introduce into their pricing structure an additional profit element, which nobody, I'm afraid, can actually identify it clearly nor condemn it, because you cannot see it. For instance, when we, and I'll give you a couple of examples, during the COVID era, we had a lot of complaints by the shipping companies that freight was down, and then all of a sudden, freight charges went up a multiple of tenths. Today we see, for instance, a severe increase in the in traveling with airplane tickets price, which again is substantial increase from what we knew a few years back. So I am sure that companies have done it, although they are mitigating against their own initial, let's say, increased cost, and using techniques like shrinkflation and other similar methods. Yes, they took advantage, at least some of the factors that some of the businesses and the products that are of inelastic demand. I think those ones were the most susceptible to these concealed increases.
Maybe we come back to questions. Final question before I turn to the public. Now, if you ask people and you tell them inflation is now 2%, they will laugh. They say it's not 2%, it's 10%. So the perception of people about inflation seems to be quite different to what we tell them. So what is your take on that? How is it true, and how does this affect the households, the way households behave?
Again, I'll try to answer it with some numbers. Being an accountant, I couldn't do otherwise, so obviously. Let me compare inflation rates with GDP growth. We had since 2021 positive GDP growth, but declining though. Whilst we had the opposite with inflation, and if you notice from 2022 onwards, the inflation rate is higher than GDP. So what we produce is been taken over by inflation. So we don't see the effect of the increases. In addition, the consumer price index has also exhibited a significant increase for about 20%, I would say, in the last 3 years, which again is an indication of increased prices. So it's the rate of change over time of prices. The other thing that, again, we bypass and might increase the perception gap is that when we discuss inflation, we discuss about CPI, we do not include taxes. We do not include contributions as an employer. We do not include other factors, that interest rates maybe, that we are also a fact that they're also increasing, which in essence, what they do, they reduce the disposable income, as it was mentioned earlier. So from the disposable income side, the difference, the loss is much greater than the inflation per se.
Okay, so some people would go even so far to say that vulnerable facing different inflation. That's why perception is different. Because what we buy for everyday life much more expensive than what the inflation measures on average. Our perception is shaped by when we go to supermarket.
Because also the remuneration, the earnings haven't increased in a similar manner, and in absolute terms, maybe we are at the same stage as a few years back in absolute terms.
Okay, so we still have some time. It's your time now. Charalambous.
I agree with you, Andreas, when you said at the beginning that we are talking about a very complex subject. Unfortunately, the way this subject is being handled, I think is in a very simplistic way, not only among politicians, who are the usual suspects, and the public at large, but also among people who call themselves experts or analysts or whatever. Just to give you a few examples, inflation is not uniform across all countries of the world, across all regions in a country, or all sectors of the economy. There was a mention about energy prices and how those have contributed. Despite of what a lot of people were saying about the importance of geopolitics on energy prices, in effect, the weak demand, and this, as China is the main reason for this, and the increase in supply because of the US were a lot more important than any geopolitics. Now, whether this thing changes in the next few days, I cannot know. Another thing that has not been mentioned, which is an important contributory factor, is housing. There is a housing crisis in most countries of the world. Housing crisis is not in all cities of a country. It's in the major urban areas, and there are various factors, and geopolitics play a very important role if, as a result of the movement of populations because of wars, refugees, etc., then there's going to be, things will be even worse. Or centers where there is a very large student population. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe another question from somebody. Please.
Yes, I do have one. I want to build on some of the things that Marius has mentioned. So when it comes to shrinkflation specifically, as well as the degrading quality of products, I think there's an unwillingness to regulate, in the sense that, let's take shrinkflation, for example, or, Coca-Cola. Let's take that, for example. So you have this drink, which Robert Kennedy said it's actually better for you to buy Coca-Cola in Mexico than the United States because of all the chemicals that they put in there. They basically poison the people. Now, how does that compound? Sick people, naturally, we have companies like Pfizer, AstraZeneca. Naturally, when you're sick, they profit, right? So you see increased company margins. They feed into, they translate actually into increased taxation. So there's this whole feedback loop where the more deterioration, let's say, you notice in society, the more on-paper gains there are. And that's just one example with Coca-Cola. We've seen similar things with oil since 2020. We keep experiencing that, where the price of oil is decreasing, but for some reason we still pay the same as like 2 years ago. There's a feedback loop. So there's an unwillingness to regulate. I was just give us your thoughts on this and how perhaps we can create a new regulatory framework.
I'm not sure it's regulation or more transparency we need to make the consumer aware. When he goes to the supermarket and he's in a rush and he's throwing things in the basket, and he goes and he finds that, but I need to go to the supermarket again because they didn't last as in the past. What is happening? And he doesn't know what is happening, and he thinks prices have increased. I didn't see them increase. And there, I think it's the role of the media as well. It's also the role of consumer groups in Greece and, as I said, in the abroad you had BBC. In Cyprus, there was one mention by the consumer group that they reduced the size of Tashinopita. One, okay. Yes, it's a classic example. I experienced it. I used to go to a coffee shop, and all of a sudden the Tashinopita ran.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Okay. It's more of an education issue rather than a legal and it's tired.
We still have limited time, so maybe I give everybody if they wish to add, maybe also going on what is the inflation now. Things evolve.
Change, like a change. All right, let me comment on this last point of where things are going, picking up from George's comments about asset prices and housing prices and the long-term perspective. Now, housing and asset price inflation was part of the story. So we've had in the past 20 years or something, from 28 onwards, we had two kinds of inflation: asset prices and consumer prices. Both were important. So housing went up tremendously, and that reduced the buying power of most of us. Because what you can spend in the marketplace, it was left in your pocket after you pay everything else, including your housing expenses in terms of rents or mortgages. Now, thinking long term, let me make one very quick comment. Think about 1980. Back then, we had inflation at 14, 15%. We had interest rates at 20% in the United States. a mortgage would cost 25%, right? We came down from that position in 1980 down to zero inflation, or very low inflation, negative interest rates in Europe, Japan, and other places by 2020. So that 40-year period, right, included things like globalization, like the peace dividend, right? Included things like companies moving offshore and chasing the cheap labor in China or Asia, right? All these factors contributed. Then we broke the backbone of labor unions in 1980. The Volcker shock, right, destroyed labor unions. Two things: the high costs of borrowing, and at the same time, the industrialization of the West, sending industries to Asia and China. That's reduces the power of the unions. Come to today, and all those factors are being reversed. Peace, we don't have war. Globalization is not being reversed, right? So they're coming back. The value chains are coming back from China. They're coming to more friendly shores, and sometimes they go onshore. So all these reversals mean that the long-term outlook for inflation is not very easy. I think it's going to be more precious to go higher, longer term. There will be fluctuations. And on average, we may end up with a longer period of higher than the target inflation for some time.
Okay, so we managed to remain within our timetable. Thank you for that, to the speakers, and thank you for attending.